So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another tier list, and we're going to be moving on to one of the Orc factions today, and I figured when it comes to the Orcs, why not start with the overlords of them all, which is of course Mordor. Now Mordor are kind of an interesting faction because they're not a faction I particularly rate too highly. I feel as though the other Orc factions kind of do, in pieces, everything Mordor does but better. So when it comes to being hyper aggressive and on the front foot, I think Angmar do it a little bit better. When it comes to having more of a balanced approach, Isengard do it better. And when it comes to just being a swarm, I think the Misty Mountains do that better. Having said that, Mordor probably do have a pretty good mix of all of those things, with the possible exception of Isengard's more balanced approach. Mordor very much a split between their low tier and their high tier units. But this isn't just a tier list based on where the units rank relative to one another, it's how useful they are to the faction as an overall thing. So the low tier orcs are not going to find themselves nestling in F or D necessarily, just as the high tier units may very well not find themselves up in A or S. And that is quite interesting with Mordor, because they do have some very cheap options which I actually do rate very highly. And we're actually going to start off with one of them, the Orc Fodder. Now the Orc Fodder have got one very significant fact going for them, and that is that the first unit is completely free. So you lose basically nothing by bringing them. They will always be cost effective because they have no cost. So, at least for the first unit, but even if you go into the red limit on them, you're only paying a couple of hundred florins for a second unit of them as well, which is cheaper than anything else in the roster still. And so with all of that in mind, obviously in terms of their abilities in combat are very limited. They do have a spear, so they do technically have an anti-cavalry bonus, even if a charge will leave them reeling, of course. But based on the fact that you lose nothing from bringing them, and also the fact that it does free up a few more funds for Mordor to bring some of their very important to them elite tier units, I think you have to put the Orc Fodder into A tier. Like, for me, they do everything you need them to do, considering they're a free unit. They also have the slight advantage over some of the other free units in the game, that they do have that anti-cavalry bonus, so you can use them as a more effective screen for stopping enemy cavalry units, because cavalry might not want to charge into the Orc Fodder if they're already a little bit damaged, because it could be the final nail in their coffin. So I do think of all the free units, the Orc Fodder are actually the best ones. And where the Orc Fodder shines, that's kind of to the detriment of the Moran Guard, which are the effectively standard tier spearman unit that Mordor have available to them. Now my big issue with the Moran Guard is the fact that they are not particularly great in combat. All of the Moran units, after all, prioritise numbers over individual prowess, so their damage against other infantry is going to be very low. They are better in combat than the Orc Fodder. They have better armour, they have slightly better stats, but you do pay a few hundred florins for them, whereas the Orc Fodder, you would have to bring 3 of them before the cost overrides the Moran Guard. Not only that, but there is nearly 50 more fodder in the unit than the Moran Guard, and for me, the Moran Guard is one of those units that is kind of redundant by association in the game. There are other factions which have that. I think we've already gone through a couple of them in the previous videos. For example, the 2nd Legion Axe Guard, while still a very good unit, the Hammers of Gundabad are the ones that I would bring all of the time. Only in that case, at least, the 2nd Legion Axe Guard are a very strong unit in their own right, and if you are up against an armoured faction, then you want to bring as much armour piercing as possible. With the Moran Guard, I really don't see the point in bringing them unless you want to blanket your line with spears and more anti-cav, but even when it comes to that, Mordor have got better ways of accomplishing that, I believe. They're not completely useless. I do see the merits in bringing them sometimes, but not very often, so I think you have to put them into D. Then we move on to the Moran infantry, so the standard line infantry for Mordor. This is what large portions of your front line are probably going to be made out of more often than not, mainly because it's kind of a necessity. The other Moran units, after all, with the exception of the Guard, who I've already mentioned you probably won't be needing to bring an awful lot of the time, are the only shielded Moran unit, the Moran infantry. Once again, they focus on numbers over the sort of the more quality focus that some of the other factions have. So in relation to a Kingdoms of Men-at-Arms unit, they will have around 40 to 50 more orcs in the unit than they have men. But obviously the individual quality is also slightly less, and this is a problem. If Mordor manage to gain momentum and start to sort of swarm over the enemy with sheer numbers, the Moran infantry can be very good in helping that push continue. Because again, their armour is okay for the tier of unit they are. It's obviously nothing too special, but I mean there are units that are worse off than them in that regard. They're shielded, in combat they're not completely useless, but they're not completely great either. I think this is the very definition of a thoroughly average unit, to be honest with you. It does what it says on the tin. I don't rate them all that highly, to be honest with you. I think that Mordor have got some very good options when it comes to slightly stronger shielded units that you can definitely spec into. And also I think the other Moran units that are around them, with the exception of the Guard, of course, are slightly more useful and offer a little bit more utility to Mordor. But there's nothing really wrong with the Moran infantry either, so I think for that reason I've got to put them into C. Now we move on to Mordor's one and only Phalanx unit, the Moran Halberds. Now Phalanx units can be very important for taking cost-effective engagements, because of course it allows you to have a relatively cheap unit, and even against more expensive targets, if the Phalanx can keep them away, you're going to do more damage over time. Halberdiers as well have got that armor piercing, and even out of Phalanx formation, Halberdiers can actually be quite useful. I mean, pikes almost completely lose their effectiveness when you take them out of Phalanx because their stats are so poor and their attack values are so low. But that's not really the case with Halberdiers. They can sort of act as ghetto axemen if you do take them out, so they do have a bit of extra utility there. As with most of the other, all of the other Moran units, they have 203 men in the unit. So obviously that's going to be giving them that numbers on the front line. The only problem that they do have is the fact that Halberds can be outranged by pikes. And obviously that is going to be a problem for Mordor. The main reason you'd want to bring the Halberds, I think, is to act as that anchor to your line. And the fact of the matter is they don't do that job as well as pikemen do. So if you do want to counteract Mordor sort of sitting within their shell and trying to outlast you, with the Halberdiers, pikes are the obvious counter. That is the case with any Halberdier, but a lot of other factions have got a more ready-made answer to that. Whereas Mordor, their answer to that is to try and be aggressive and overwhelm pike lines, rather than trying to withstand them like that. So if you do go for that approach and you get countered by pikes, you've probably dug your own grave there, to be honest with you. But having said that, the Moran Halberds are a good example of a unit I think that definitely have their place in the Mordor roster. I'd put them into B, because I think they do their job very well. For a relatively low cost unit with a Phalanx, does okay. Obviously their weaknesses are very clearly defined, so you do have to look after them to a certain extent. But I rate them more highly than Moran infantry personally. But very often you will see the two of them together form the basis of Mordor's front line. Then we have the Orc Maulers, not to be confused with the Orc Fellers from Angmar, but they're pretty much the same thing. This is a very interesting unit for me, because these low-tier Orc shock infantry units, especially in the last patch actually, before the other shock infantry was sort of made a little bit better, they were by far and away some of the most cost-effective units in the game when it came to dealing with armoured units, because they do have that armour piercing. Obviously the individual quality is not there, but when you swarm over an enemy faction, especially an armoured one, with units like this, they can really pay for themselves really very quickly. Now, of course, just like the Moran Halberds, perhaps even more so because their armour is actually slightly less, the Orc Maulers are going to be very weak to arrow fire, and it's going to be a plentiful source of kills to your opponent if you find them isolated and arrows shooting into them, which is obviously not great. But that's part and parcel of using shock infantry, and generally speaking there are enough of them to the point where if you bring several units of them, even if they do die in droves, there are enough of them that it's still a bit of an issue for the enemy. This was something that I honestly had a few problems in deciding where to put them, but I'm actually going to put them into A tier, I think. This is another example of a low tier unit which I think really does its job very, very well. Now you could very easily drop this down to B or even C tier if you're going up against a lightly armoured faction, but to be honest with you, if you're bringing something like Orc Maulers en masse against a faction like Linden or Harad, I'd question the composition, to be honest with you. So again, in part of the compositions that they are good in, I would say that the Orc Maulers actually deserve a spot in A. Then we move past the sort of bread and butter of Mordor's line, at least as it pertains to melee, and we start to head into some of their more exciting units. Starting off with maybe a little bit more of a mundane one, or at least one that helps the mundanes, the Troll Drummers. Now the Troll Drummers are a unit which is effectively shared by Mordor and the Misty Mountains, partly by necessity because their front lines are of course the most numbers focused, not an awful lot of quality on the lines. It may be interspersed in there here and there, but with how big Mordor's lines can be, you might need an extra morale battery in there to help them out. This is a very changeable unit, to be fair. In quicker battles, you're unlikely to see the Troll Drummers seem to make that big of an impact, because the battle's over before morale really starts to become a problem, or if it does, it's something that the Troll Drummers either don't affect because it's enemy morale, or if your army's breaking quickly, it's something the Troll Drummers won't be able to salvage. It's one of those sort of things. But in longer battles, especially in sieges, where one of the Orcs' main problems is keeping the assaults going and wearing the enemy down, which is one of their best ways they can deal with very dug-in defenders. You need that extra morale to keep your lower tier orcs on the front line for as long as possible to make sure the enemy is worn down, and in that case the troll drummers absolutely shine. They're probably your best tool for doing that because they're difficult to snipe out as well. Artillery can do it, of course, but archers, and even crossbows and javelins, to be fair, will have a little bit of an issue doing it because they'll survive that first volley, and then the Mordor player is very likely to get them out of harm's way. With that in mind, where would I put them? I think B is probably fair for that, because I mean, as a unit, it's really how they affect other units that's the main attraction here. If they get into combat, they are still trolls, so they can do a half-decent job, but they will still get worn down fairly easily by anything of any sort of quality. So I think B is probably about fair for the troll drummers. Then, Sauron's Will, the higher-end Axemen for Mordor. They have a lot of different things. They have the morale buffing capabilities, bigger armor piercing values than the lower tier Orc Maulers, but they're a lot more expensive than the Orc Maulers, and there are less men in the unit, and they have effectively the same weaknesses. Their armor is stronger, but they are still sort of slightly mid upper tier Orcs, so the armor is better, but it's still not world beating. It's not on the same level as some of the Western Kingdoms of Men or the Dwarves. And with that in mind, they're a very effective unit, especially if you're going for a more quality-heavy Mordor army, potentially. If you're on the defence, for example, in a siege, and you've got a lot more money to play with, then of course you're probably going to want to have the higher-tier units, because cost is not so much of a problem when you have that much money to play with. I actually would rate the Sauron's Will below the Orc Maulers, to be honest with you, from a pure efficiency standpoint. Efficiency is very important for Mordor, because a lot of their units are going to be of lower quality anyway. And you're going to have to sort of take effective trades. Considering the fact they have pretty much exactly the same counters, I'm putting the Sauron's Will into B. I really do think that the cheap Orc Axemen are one of those gems in the Orc rosters that you can really leverage to your advantage. The Sauron's Will are still all fine and good, but they come more into line with a lot of the other sort of heavier Axemen that are just okay, just a little bit above average for me. Not on the same level as something as efficient as the Orc Maulers or something as heavy duty as the Axemen of Lasarnak from Gondor. Now, a unit class which has been fairly controversial ever since its introduction into Reforged, the sort of Great Shield Infantry, the bulldozers of Reforged, the units that you use to push through enemy lines, the Blackguard of Barad-dûr, the ones that have now got their new makeover. A very important part, because if orcs were bottled up by really strong phalanxes, especially in narrower maps like Moria, the outcome would be obvious every single time. This is a unit which does allow them some flexibility. It has very clearly defined weaknesses though. As soon as they push through the lines, they will tend to fizzle out pretty quickly because their abilities in sustained combat are actually not that great. Their armor is good and their shield value is massive, of course, which means they're pretty good at taking arrows, but when it comes to actually fighting in melee, they don't really have the damage to go toe-to-toe with units that are a similar cost to themselves. Obviously, lower tier units they will be able to ultimately defeat, but when you're pushing through lines, it's not just going to be a single unit of lower tier infantry that you're really going to be facing off against. It's going to be all sorts of things. With that in mind, I think the utility of pushing through the lines is such an important part of what Mordor and ultimately factions with the Blackwatch Legion like Angmar are capable of doing. We have seen it fail more often than not. I mean, when they were first introduced, it tended to succeed more often. Now it tends to fail because I think people jump the gun a little bit too quickly with them. And people have also gotten good at recognising when they're coming forward and reinforcing the line to make sure it doesn't buckle under a push. I think the fact that if you deploy them at the right time, it can really swing a battle. I think you've got to put them into A, because they are capable of doing what really no other kind of unit in the game is capable of doing. Trolls can do it, but they don't blast the line apart as they push through. They just sort of run through on their own and then isolate themselves if you're not careful. There are ways to make trolls do the same thing, but it's a little bit more difficult, I think. With the Great Shield Infantry, it's really just click and go, and if you've deployed them at the right time, then they will bear fruit for you. Yeah, I think A is probably fair for the Blackguard. Now, Minas Morgul Chosen. A staple in many Mordor armies, I have to say, which, considering they're a more expensive defensive spearmen, is quite interesting, because they have the same issue that many higher-end spearmen tend to have, and that is the fact they don't do damage all that quickly. However, having said that, I can see why they form a part of the Mordor line, because it allows the Mordor front line to be a lot tougher. Their armor and their shield value is very, very good, and it allows everything to be tied together a little bit better. Like, you're more likely to see the Minas Morgul Chosen performing that role because of their defensive abilities than the Saurons will because of their aggressive ones. And obviously you can't really do it with the Blackguard because they're intended to be aggressive all of the time. And unlike the Moran on guard, they are obviously substantially stronger than the Orc Fodder in melee. Very tanky, very numerous. Obviously they've been given their new model as well, so they don't have the Jack Skellington looking logo on their shield. I've been wondering, I think A is fair for them because you see them so often and they perform their role so well a lot of the time. Like, the Mordor, if Mordor fails, generally speaking, it's because of the units around the Minas Morgul Chosen starting to buckle and then them just being overrun. Wherever the Minas Morgul Chosen are, it represents a real strong point in the Mordor line, counteracted by AP, of course. But yeah, I think that's probably fair. Now we get into the bodyguard tier units, of which Mordor have a few, and all of them are pretty different in the strengths they offer. Starting off with probably the most mundane of them all in the Uruk Captains. Now, the Uruk Captains are armor-piercing bodyguard troops. It's an interesting thing, though, because I've been debating where to put them. I think you see them a lot because they're the cheapest of the bodyguard units, they're the most defensive, it's a reasonably safe place to put your general. Allows you as well to maybe save a few florins here and there to spend on something else. I think A is fair for them. A lot of sword and board bodyguard units like this will tend to find their way into A unless I feel as though there's a reason they should be lower, like the Wardens of the White Tower. But with the Uruk Captains you see them quite a lot, and I feel as though there is a good reason for that. Because they are the cheapest, and generally speaking they'll perform their role adequately, I would say, would be the right word for them. Now, this is a unit which I really do kind of struggle with, to be honest with you, because we have the Nazgl. Now, the Nazgl individually are some of the strongest melee combatants that there are, because they have so many HP, their stats are really high. If you embed them properly into a bunch of like Moran on infantry, for example, you can't really single them out, and slowly but surely they will go about their work. I do think, however, that they are probably not S tier. And the reason for that is, for the Nazgl to sort of rack up their kill counts, which they do, very often they do, takes quite a long time. In more open battles, generally speaking, the battle will be decided by things going on around the Nazgl rather than the Nazgl being the match winners themselves. They find their niche very effectively in a siege, especially an aggressive one, because very high quality front lines can find themselves getting slowly whittled down by Nazgl that are being backed up by a meat shield. But I feel as though battles more often than not are decided by factors other than the Nazgl when you see them, which would be my reasoning for not putting them into S tier. Now, I mean, they're still solidly A tier because, you know, they're so difficult to deal with. Like, unless you can isolate them and like cycle charge them or just overwhelm them with decent quality infantry, they're going to be a real problem to deal with. But that's where I would put the Nazgl for me. I think that's probably fair for them. Now then, another unit which I've been struggling to place, to be honest with you, the Temple Executioners. Now, the Temple Executioners kind of have the same problem in the sense that, again, there's more of them though, so they are capable of dishing out quite a lot of blows per second, as opposed to the Nazgl where there are only 12 in the unit when you're on larger settings. Temple Executioners with the 63. It's another interesting unit. You can upgrade the armour, which is an interesting distinction that most other bodyguard tier heavy swordsmen do not have. It puts them probably above the Haven Guard, I would suggest. The only two heavy swordsman units I would rate more highly than the Temple Executioners would be the Noldorin Blade Masters and, of course, the Pharazim Sword Masters. Temple Executioners. Definitely a tricky one, this, because I kind of want to put them into S, if I'm being honest. Because I've seen them... Yeah, but I've not seen them do anything more than the Nazgl, to be honest. I think we will put them into S for now. I may change my mind on that, though. It's very debatable whether or not they deserve their position there. But what puts them above the Nazgl, in my opinion, is the fact that they can do damage a little bit quicker. And they don't need to be babied to the same extent that the Nazgl do. Even on an open field, like, there are more of them. so they're less likely to just get straight up overwhelmed by units. And that would be my reasoning, but very close. I mean, you could make the argument that Executioners could be down in A, Nazgl could be up, they could be switched. I don't know, it's a difficult one for me. Next, Olag High. I think Olag High, what I'm going to do straight away is put them into A as well. Because the Olag High are probably the strongest trolls in the game, or at least among the strongest trolls in the game. I mean, there are 3 other units which perform pretty much identical roles to the Olag High. They, among the trolls, are the best at standing up to punishment, which I think puts them into A. A lot of other trolls, I think, would go lower down. None below C, I don't think, but none above A. Because trolls, they're simply quite difficult to use. They can be used to smash lines up in the same way as the Blackguard of Barad-dûr can be. And they're better at dealing damage to infantry as well, but they're very much a flash in the pan, trolls. Like, when you commit them to a line, they will be whittled down maybe faster than you would expect, even the tankier ones like the Olag High. But I think A is just the right place for them. Like, for me, I've seen the trolls die off quickly more often than not. Like, if you commit them to a good engagement for them against like low tier pikes, they're obviously going to clean up and not take much damage at all. But trolls are easily counteracted for me, and I think A is probably the right place for the Olag High, because they are ultimately probably the strongest unit of trolls in the game, and I think A is probably about fair for them. Now we move on to Mordor's skirmish line, which is actually pretty good. I mean, it's probably the thing which does set them apart from Angmar when it comes to being that ultra aggressive faction. And to be honest with you, all of the Orc factions, actually, none of them have got an archer lineup especially that's as good as Mordor's. Isengard have got their crossbows, but that's where their skirmish power really begins and ends. The Misty Mountains skirmish line, again, their crossbows, the only thing they really have going for them. And Angmar's skirmish line, the less said about that one, the better. Orc Archers. Cheap archers, they definitely have their place in the game now. Previously, they were the be-all and end-all. Now, you have to be a little bit more careful. You can't just overwhelm a really good unit of archers with a unit of trash like this. If you go up against something like a unit of marksmen of Caer Andros, your superior numbers will not win you that fight. You will lose pretty heavily. But I think B is right for them, because on the attack, you know, just occupying the enemy skirmishers, whittling away at their numbers, slowly but surely, allowing your army to be the powerhouse that it is, just being that supporting tool in the back. I think the Orc Archers do that perfectly well. Don't expect the world from them, but if you use them to be that sort of annoyance when you're on the attack in a siege, or in a field battle even, just to be that support for an aggressive push, they can do that job just fine. But don't expect them to win these skirmish fights, just expect them to be that distraction. But they do that very well. Orc Javelins. This is another unit, alongside their fodder brethren, I'm going to put into A tier, unironically. Because they're so cheap, and javelins, even with low missile damage like this, with their armor-piercing damage, are capable of doing the damage you need them to do. I think you can't really put them into anything other than A tier. You could even make the case for putting them into S. You could also make the case for putting the Orc Fodder into S, to be honest with you, because they cost you literally nothing. So they have basically 100% cost efficiency, which only the other 3 units in the game can truly boast. I think the Orc Javelins, though, you can't really put them into S tier because they don't have the match-winning potential that like some of the really good Javelins do, which may very well find themselves into S tier. But I think A tier is perfectly fine for them. Like, they are very cheap for the damage they can potentially offer you as a support for your front line as well, especially against the more heavily armoured, more rooted factions like the Dwarves, like some of the Western Kingdoms, like Gondor. Even against a faction like Imladris with their very solid front line, if you get a few volleys from the Orc Javelins into them, a few of those elves will drop, and that's all you really need to know about the Orc Javelins. Yes, they're trash, they're filth, but they're effective filth for the cost. Now though, Brannan Archers, I think I'm going to put them into C tier for the same reason as the Moran Infantry. Like, they really are just the archer version of them, in the sense they don't really do an awful lot wrong, but they are a painfully average unit. You're still not going to be winning any skirmish fights with them against Kingdoms of Men. Which actually has me thinking maybe they should go into D tier, to be honest with you, because, you know, they're... But no, I think C is probably fair, because they do better in a skirmish fight, and if you combine them maybe with some of the other archers, you can give Mordor a pretty scary skirmish line, and they're just sort of the workhorse in the middle. But they are by no means like a show-stopping archer unit. Like, they will still lose the vast majority of skirmish fights unless you're going up against a really lightly armoured skirmisher, then they may very well win. But again, it's a case of don't expect the world from them. They'll be slightly better than the Orc Archers at doing their job, but they're also more expensive and there are less of them. So there's a bit less margin for error and maybe a little bit less cost efficiency as well. So I think C is pretty fair for them. Now, Adunheim Shadow Bows, another tool which the Orcs, only the Lurtz Hunting Pack, offers Isengard some body piercing. But they're a bodyguard tier unit, so it's a little bit different. The Adunheim Shadow Bows are just a tried and true unit of Rangers, except for one difference, which is something which actually I learned about in the last patch really, and it kind of caught me off guard. Their armour is pretty damn good. The main thing that a lot of Rangers have going against them is the fact they have very light armour, and they're really easy to snipe out with a unit of just basic archers. Like, you can just saturate fire onto them and all of a sudden the Rangers are gone. It's not really something you can do too easily with the Adunheim Shadow Bows. They can engage in a skirmish fight, while you may not want to because their ammunition is valuable. If you find yourself having no choice but to do that, they'll perform pretty well. And considering the fact that the baseline Rangers, I would put all of them really into A tier because of the destruction they can cause, which, again, any Ranger is capable of getting over 1,000 kills, which kind of says it all really. With the addition of their armour, with their tankiness, this is a unit of Rangers I would put into S tier. This is one of the 2 or 3 that I would give that distinction to. Just because it's something that really no other Ranger can do. No other Ranger has the armour that the Adunheim Shadow Bows have access to. Temple Guard, Armour Piercing Archer. I think actually I've talked myself into putting the Temple Executioners back down here into A tier, because the Temple Guard, honestly, aren't that much worse than the Temple Executioners in melee. They are worse, of course, and you can't upgrade the armour, so it is a step down in melee, but they of course add the ability to shoot people with their big armor-piercing Númenórean steel bows first. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. I'm going to put them into S as well. Armor-piercing arrows on their own aren't necessarily the sort of thing that will get you into S tier, as we learnt with the Wardens of Minas Ithil, but the Temple Executioners are more heavily armoured, much stronger in melee. They can't hide anywhere, but they don't really need to hide. They're going to be one of those tools that you use as Mordor to go after a single target with their bows, and then muck in melee to help the infantry. And I think for that reason, all round, I do think they deserve their spot in S tier. Adunheim Lancers. We get into Mordor's mounted companies, which are, generally speaking, very expensive, but the quality is there. They're not dissimilar from Umbar in that regard. And the Adunheim Lancers is a unit they share with Umbar. But I don't think you can go anywhere above B tier with the Adunheim Lancers, to be honest with you. They're a very tanky unit of regular heavy Lancers, very heavily armoured, very heavily shielded. But Lancers like this are still the sort of thing that will very rarely creep above B tier, I think. They are more effective than they used to be. The morale is increased. Generally speaking, their cost effectiveness is a little bit better than it was outside of the bodyguard tier now. But I think the Adunheim Lancers, especially in conjunction with the other Mordor units, which have a little bit more of a melee cavalry edge to them, they're kind of like the odd one out in that regard. But they are still really Mordor's damage dealers on horseback when you look at them like that. So I think B is probably fair for them. Temple Inquisitors. Now then, where to put the Inquisitors? They are obviously the mounted version of the Executioners, really. And I think they also deserve a spot in A tier. A lot of units in A tier for Mordor, a lot of units which are pretty efficient. And that's because they may not be multiple HP, but as far as melee cavalry goes, especially when you combine them with the genuine bodyguard tier unit that Mordor have on horseback, it is clashing with Mordor in sort of a mounted duel is something you really want to consider carefully. There are a few factions that can do it, but even they are going to come out of the other side looking very, very wounded. And the Temple Inquisitors are not the sort of thing you want to go after with a lot of cavalry. You can kite them down, of course. They don't have a shield. They're heavily armoured, but they don't have a shield, so horse archers can potentially be a good thing to slowly whittle them down, or even mounted javelin men, slightly more damaging, but obviously much more in harm's way, run the risk of getting caught by them and their long swords. But I think it's more a matter of having them used in conjunction with the other unit we'll get onto a bit later. Beasts of Gorgoroth. This is not a unit I've seen used enough, really. And I think that's because, generally speaking, big war beast units like this, time and time again, you'll see them run amok. And that is an issue. Like, the Mumakil are tankier than them, so it'll take them a little bit longer to run amok, but they still will. The main advantage they have over the Mumakil is the fact that their riders use javelins instead of bows, so their missile attacks are slightly more effective. But other than that, They really are just the Poundland version of Mumakil. It's a nice tool for Mordor to have, and it can, potentially, because they're not seen maybe as much as you would imagine, considering their stature and their power, they can catch an opponent off guard. And if they don't have like beefy javelins or a lot of spears and pikes and armor-piercing units to bring them down quickly, or fire arrows to make them run amok, it can be an issue. But time and time again, I've seen units like this, Elephant Clash units like the Mumakil and the Beasts of Gorgoroth. Every time I see them, they're always running amok, running around the perimeter of the battlefield. And I think for that reason, considering the cost, the potential for something really good is there, but also the potential for it to be a complete waste is there. So I think for that reason, you have to put them into C. Sort of bang average unit, really. And then, Melkor's Chosen. Melkor's Chosen are effectively in the same sort of category as knights. They're not technically knights. I mean, you could view them as melee knights, I suppose. But they're one of two units in the game which is something you want to avoid with all other cavalry, really, in a one-on-one battle. You know, the Melkor's Chosen, the Champions of the White Hand from Isengard, are the two units which they want more than anything to just catch a really nice, juicy unit of high-tier cavalry and start going to town on it. Because these Caragor riders are really, really deadly against other cavalry units. Like, they are capable of performing the same role as knights as well, charging into infantry and doing a lot of damage. They won't be as effective as that as like the lance cavalry knights from like Imladris or Lindon or Rohan, or even a place like Rune. But their abilities on horseback, their primary function, is something which is only rivaled by Isengard's units. Isengard's unit is actually more damaging than the Melkor's Chosen, but the Melkor's Chosen a bit better at keeping themselves alive with their armour and their slight shield value. Big mace that they wield. I think because they are ultimately, arguably, the unit that's best in class at doing this, I think that does warrant them a spot up in S. I think the Melkor's Chosen do deserve to be there because, especially if you back them up with the Temple Inquisitors, maybe even a unit of Adunime Lancers just to give yourself a bit of a charge as well, it's a very scary cavalry line. I do think that there are grades to how useful each one is, like you can see here. But for best results, you really might want to use them all together, all at once. But that will, of course, be very expensive and take away from your infantry line. But it's an option that Mordor have. And then we have the first unit of artillery in these tier lists, because it's the first unit that's unique in any way, really. And that is, of course, the Troll Catapult. It's just a standard catapult when it comes to dealing damage, but the crew are trolls, which means they can defend themselves a little bit better in melee. And, of course, the main reason why I'd want to bring the Troll Catapult is the fact that it gets pushed a lot faster than a standard catapult. One of the main problems with Medieval 2 Siege is how slowly it moves across ground. Not an issue for the Trolls, which, considering how useful a catapult can be, this is another unit I think you have to put into A. Just because we know how good a catapult can be, and I think the Trolls manning it only make that just a little bit better. But it has the same pitfalls as any other catapult, so do bear that in mind. And there we have it, Mordor. Very few in the way of duds. I wouldn't give them as many sort of super high tier or S tier units as Khazad-dûm had last time around. But the one thing I think Mordor have is they have a massive range of units that I would put into A tier, because all across the line, whether it's the cheaper units like the Javelins, the Fodder and the Maulers, or whether it's the really expensive stuff like the Nazgl or Temple Executioners or Olag High, there's so much that they have. It's hard for you to go wrong, I think. As long as you have an idea of how you want to proceed, whether you want to be hyper aggressive, whether you want to have just a core of cheap infantry that's just designed to hold the enemy and then use your decent archers and cavalry to maybe pull the enemy apart, Mordor are a deceptively versatile faction, I think, in those terms. And I say this as a person who actually maybe doesn't rate Mordor all that highly. Like, I don't really play as Mordor all that well a lot of the time. And part of the reason is maybe because I don't have that that unified look on how to approach a battle. A lot of the time I want to maybe spread my resources too thin for Mordor. But they're a faction I think definitely has the tools to be very, very effective. Having said that, I do think there are a few pitfalls that they can fall into. I think the Moran Guard are most certainly the most redundant unit in the Mordor roster just because of everything that's all around them. And Mordor, like any Orc faction, despite the fact that I would rate quite a lot of their units quite highly, you do have to bear in mind that they do have all the same pitfalls. Low morale, generally speaking, low quality. If you're good at being on the attack, if you want to be aggressive, if you want to try and overwhelm your opponents, and you want to have that bit of good support in the back lines, then Mordor are going to be for you, because especially with that support in the back lines, As you can see here, a mounted unit and 2 units of archers are the units that I would put into S tier for Mordor, which I think is what sets them apart from the other factions like Angmar, who have a lot more of their strength front and centre. So perhaps going through this, it's maybe not as much of a surprise as it should be that it's 2 units of archers and a unit of effectively cavalry that Mordor have as what I would say is their most highly rated units. But yeah, let me know what you think. I think putting the Executioners and the Nazgl down in A tier and not in S tier might be a bit controversial, but I'm trying to be really selective with S tier, as I've already mentioned. Like, I'm trying to be quite harsh, and I do think the Executioners and the Nazgl, like, a lot of the time you'll see battles decided, whether it's a siege or on the field, decided by other factors, whether the enemy manages to sort of defeat your army in other places, or whether they fail to do that, and then slowly but surely the Nazgl and Executioners are able to do their job. Again, it's subjective, these lists, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. Like, this isn't mathematically proven by any means, but do let me know what you think, because Mordor's another one of those factions I think they've got a lot of options, big roster, but I would actually rate quite a lot of their units quite highly, interestingly enough. Huge proportion of their units in A tier. But yeah, next tier list I think we're going to do Evil Men and then go back to the Elves. So first Evil Men faction I think we'll go with Rune. And Elves, I've had a few requests for Mirkwood, so we'll do that. So those will be the next 2, I think. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.